The plan for Omaha Beach was a thing of brutal, geometric simplicity on paper and catastrophic complexity in reality. Codenamed Bloody Omaha by the planners who already feared its cost, this 6-mile crescent of sand was the linchpin of the American landing zones. Its capture was essential to linking the British beaches to the east with the American Utah beach to the west. The terrain was a defender's masterpiece. High clay and shale bluffs, scarred by 5 steep draws, the only viable exits for men and vehicles off the beach. The Germans, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's relentless direction, had turned each draw into a fortified killing zone. Rommel's philosophy was stark. The war will be won or lost on the beaches. We must stop the enemy in the water before he even gets ashore. By dawn on June 6, 1944, the 352nd Infantry Division, a seasoned unit unexpectedly moved into the area, had done just that. They had woven a tapestry of death, miles of Belgian gates, hedgehogs, and mine tetrahedrons underwater, layers of barbed wire and minefields on the sand, and a final, back-breaking obstacle few plans had fully accounted for: a continuous 8-foot-high bank of shingle. These were not soft pebbles, but millions of smooth, fist-sized stones piled by centuries of tide against the base of the bluffs. For a soldier, it was a shaky, sliding nightmare to climb. For a vehicle, it was an impassable wall. The Allied plan to overcome this relied on a synchronized trip hammer of force. Heavy bombers would pulverize the coastal defenses. A massive naval bombardment would finish the job. Specially engineered amphibious tanks would swim ashore and provide immediate fire support. And finally, combat engineers, the first men off the landing craft after the infantry, would blow and bulldoze paths through the obstacles under cover of all this destruction. By 7:30 a.m. on D-Day, every element of that hammer had misfired. Part 1. The Man in the Machine. Private First Class Winton D. Dove, serial number 336-25272, was not meant for front-page history. He was a man of earth and steel, not headlines. Born and raised in the rolling hills of Virginia, the 24-year-old had the steady hands and patient demeanor of a man who understood machinery. Before the war, he operated heavy equipment on construction sites, feeling the grind of gears and the push of hydraulics as extensions of his own will. He enlisted in September 1943, married to his sweetheart Catherine, building a life put on hold by a global war. The Army, recognizing a useful skill, sent him to Fort Myer and gave him 3 weeks to master the Caterpillar D8, a 15-ton behemoth of yellow steel, the undisputed king of construction dozers. Then, they gave him his weapon of war. The D8 was modified with quarter-inch steel plates welded haphazardly to the cab and engine housing. It was crude, angular, a far cry from the sleek tanks rolling off assembly lines. The armor was meant to stop shrapnel and small arms fire. A direct hit from anything larger would turn the cab into a coffin. His officers were blunt. His mission on D-Day: land in the early waves, get to the shingle bank, and clear lanes for the tanks. The survival rate for such work, they estimated coolly, was below 20%. Among the engineers, a darker shorthand emerged: the suicide dozer. On the evening of June 5th, Dove joined 47 other men of Company C, 37th Engineer Combat Battalion, aboard the Landing Craft Infantry, LCI, 553. The atmosphere was a tight coil of tension and forced humor. These were specialists, men who diffused mines, men who handled blocks of Composition C with the care of priests, men who understood the electrical fuses of Bangalore torpedoes. Dove, with his bulldozer waiting below deck, was their muscle. As the flotilla pitched across the channel, the reality of their task settled in with the seasickness. Many, including Dove, spent the hours retching into their helmets, the acrid smell blending with the diesel fumes and fear. H hour at Omaha was 6:30 a.m. For the infantry of the 1st and 29th Divisions, hitting Dog Green, Easy Red, and Fox sectors, it quickly became a hellish wade into a storm of steel. LCA landing craft dropped ramps prematurely in deep water, drowning heavily laden men. Those who made it ashore found themselves pinned on a bare, tidal flat, swept by interlocking machine gun fire from concrete emplacements, like WN-62 and WN-64. The preliminary bombardment had failed utterly. Fearing to hit the approaching landing craft, the B-17 bombers had dropped their loads too far inland. The naval fire, though impressive, was too brief and often inaccurate against hardened targets. By the time LCI 553 approached Easy Red sector, facing the critical draw codenamed Exit E1, leading to Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, the beach was chaos. From the deck, Dove could see it, a surreal, slow-motion disaster. Burning tanks sat like funeral pyres in the surf. Landing craft lay skewed and broken. The air thrummed with a basso profundo of naval shells overhead, and the sharper, vicious cracks of incoming mortars and 88mm fire. And everywhere, men running, men falling, men crawling, men huddled behind the scant cover of a half-sunk obstacle. At 7:15, fate found Dove's craft. An 88mm armor-piercing round, fired from a dug-in gun emplacement on the bluffs, tore through the thin hull of LCI 553 with a sound like a giant can being ripped open. The explosion in the crowded hold was catastrophic. 11 engineers were killed instantly, torn apart by the blast and shrapnel. The concussion slammed Dove against a bulkhead, his ears ringing in a sudden, muffled silence. Icy channel water poured through the jagged hole, and the craft listed sharply to port. The coxswain, grim-faced, pushed forward. "Get ready!" a surviving NCO yelled, his voice distant. The ramp dropped at 7:28 into 4 feet of churning, blood-foamed water. Dove's D8, one of the first vehicles off, plunged into the sea. For 3 agonizing seconds, the waterproofing kit, a tall canvas snorkel over the exhaust and sealed ignition, was tested. The engine coughed, died, then caught again with a roar. Ahead was 200 yards of open beach. Through the scratched, water-blurred vision blocks of his cab, Dove's world narrowed to 2 things: the dark, imposing line of the shingle bank and the horizontal red threads of machine gun tracer fire cutting across his path. He lowered the blade to just above the sand, not for digging, but as a massive plow and shield. Bodies in olive drab floated past, bumped against the blade, and slid away. He did not allow himself to look at their faces. He drove on, the engine screaming in low gear, the tracks churning water and sand. He reached the relative deceptive shelter of the shingle bank at 7:42. To his left, about 50 yards away, he spotted Private First Class William J. Shoemaker, his designated relief operator, waving frantically from behind the burning hulk of a duplex-drive Sherman tank. The tank's flotation screen was still partially inflated, a surreal shroud of rubber around its dead hull. Dove cut the engine. The sudden quiet was filled with the unending staccato of machine guns, the crump of mortars, and the screams of the wounded. He scrambled out and joined Shoemaker. The 2 men didn't speak, they just pointed. 2 other armored dozers that had landed further down were already destroyed, their cabs smoking, their operators slumped over the controls or lying still on the sand nearby. Crouching behind the tank, Dove finally saw the full, 3-dimensional problem of Exit E1. The shingle bank was just the outer curtain. Beyond it, German engineers had excavated a true anti-tank ditch, 9 feet deep and 12 feet wide, running parallel to the beach for hundreds of yards. On the inland side of the ditch, the actual exit road was blocked by Czech hedgehogs and concrete pyramids reinforced with buried railroad tracks. And overlooking it all, from cleverly designed concrete toebrooks and reinforced farmhouses on the bluffs, were the machine guns and anti-tank guns of WN-65. Their fields of fire were interlocked, diagram perfect. Any movement on the beach below was target practice. The infantry's situation was desperate. Hundreds of men from the first waves were now pressed against the shingle, using the bank as their only cover. They couldn't go back into the sea, and they couldn't go forward. They were trapped in a literal kill box. German mortar teams with pre-registered coordinates were methodically walking their fire up and down the length of the bank. Each explosion sent a lethal shower of stone shrapnel into the packed GIs. Officers tried to organize rushes, only to see their men cut down within steps. The tide, indifferent to human struggle, was rising relentlessly, shrinking the usable beach by 6 inches every 10 minutes, and drowning the wounded who lay too close to the water. Dove understood the simple, brutal calculus. The entire theory of the invasion here depended on mobility. The massive follow-on waves of vehicles, the tanks of the 741st and 743rd Battalions, the trucks of the artillery, the ambulances, were useless if they couldn't get off the beach. And the only key to that mobility was physically carving a path through these obstacles. The infantry could maybe scramble over the shingle and through the ditches under fire, but vehicles could not. The demolition engineers could blow the wire and concrete, but only the bulldozer could move the thousands of cubic yards of stone and earth. His D8 was now the sole operational bulldozer in the eastern sector of Easy Red. The others were gone. The suicide mission was no longer an abstract statistic. It was his engine idling behind a pile of stones. At 8 a.m., Dove made his first push. He started the D8, its rumble drawing immediate fire. German gunners, quickly identifying the new threat, concentrated their MG-42 fire on the most visible part, the massive steel blade. Bullets struck in a frantic metallic drum roll, sparking bright orange against the painted steel. Dove couldn't raise the blade to protect himself. It would block his view entirely. He couldn't lower it fully. He'd lose his ability to dig. He settled on a middle position, the blade acting as a partial shield at chest level. He was, for all intents and purposes, driving blind into a hailstorm. The blade hit the compacted shingle. The dozer's nose reared up, tracks spinning uselessly, throwing a rooster tail of stones. Dove feathered the clutch, feeling for grip. Then, with a lurch that slammed his head against the steel canopy, the tracks bit. The D8 grunted forward 5 feet, shearing through the stone like a blunt axe. He had created a notch, a tiny, insignificant gap. But it was the first breach, and it acted as a homing beacon. German observers in the bluffs, communicating via field telephones, still miraculously intact, called down mortar fire. Dove heard the distant thump of the tubes, a sound he'd learned in training. He began counting silently. 1001, 1002. The rounds descended with a rising whistle. The first landed 20 yards to his right, the second 10 yards behind. They were bracketing him. The next salvo would be on target. He had less than 30 seconds. In a move born of pure instinct rather than training, Dove didn't retreat. He threw the dozer into reverse, backed up 10 feet, then angled the blade sharply to the left. He drove forward again, attacking the bank from a different angle. This technique, cutting from multiple sides to create a wider, more graded ramp instead of a sheer cliff, was something he'd learned moving dirt, not under fire. It worked. The gap widened to 12 feet, still not enough for a tank, but a start. A mortar round detonated 15 feet behind the dozer, the blast wave rocking the machine on its tracks. Shrapnel pattered against the rear armor like lethal rain. Inside the cab, it was an oven. The engine temperature gauge needle was buried in the red. The crude waterproofing around the exhaust manifold was failing, letting in seawater that sizzled and steamed on the hot block. The air reeked of diesel, cordite, and his own sweat. His hands gripping the levers were slick. He saw Shoemaker then, a hunched figure sprinting in a ragged zigzag across the sand, kicking up spurts of dirt near his boots from near-miss bullets. Shoemaker reached the dozer, slapped the armor twice, and Dove killed the engine. In a rehearsed ballet of survival, Shoemaker climbed up as Dove climbed down. The exchange took 8 seconds. The German snipers, for reasons known only to them, held their fire. Perhaps they understood. A working bulldozer was a necessity for their own grim purpose. A destroyed dozer would create a permanent bottleneck, trapping more Americans on the beach for them to methodically eliminate. For nearly an hour, the two men worked in this rhythm, 20-minute shifts. One man operated, blind and deaf in the roaring, shaking cab. The other guided from outside when possible, or simply crouched behind the blade, waiting for his turn, watching the tide creep closer. They slowly widened the gap to nearly 30 feet and began the Herculean task of filling the anti-tank ditch. Each blade load, about 3 cubic yards of sand and stone, was a tiny insult to the 9-foot chasm. It would take over 70 loads. They were on load number 12 when, at 0847, a sustained burst from an MG-42, aimed lower this time, found its mark. The bullets, a mixture of standard and armor-piercing rounds, walked up the right side track guard and punched through the thinner metal of the track housing itself. There was a loud, unnatural crack, snap, like a giant tree branch breaking. The right track, severed at several lengths, flew off its guide wheels. The dozer lurched violently to the right, and the engine, under sudden, immense strain, stalled. Shoemaker, at the controls, tried the starter. It whined, but the engine merely coughed and died. He pumped the throttle, flooded it, tried again. Nothing. The D8 sat silent, skewed, and helpless, its blade half in, half out of the ditch, blocking the very lane it had created. The sudden silence was deafening. Dove, crouched behind a tetrahedron obstacle, felt a cold wave of despair. The machine was broken. The mission had failed. The mathematical reality he'd understood earlier now presented his personal equation. He could stay here, relatively safe behind the steel obstacles, and likely survive for another hour, maybe 2, until the rising tide or a German assault finished everyone on this patch of sand. Or he could make a run for it. He looked at the dozer. It was 100 yards away across flat, open sand, a football field of death. Every German gunner on the bluff knew its location and would be watching for movement. To run to it was to offer himself as the sole, moving target on a gray beach. And for what? A machine that might be irreparably broken. A mechanic's job under a sniper's scope. 5 miles offshore, aboard the command cruiser USS Augusta, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, was facing his own grim calculation. Reports from Omaha were fragmentary but uniformly dreadful. Radio traffic spoke of beach mined, obstacles in place, heavy casualties, can't move off beach. Through his powerful Zeiss binoculars, the scene was a blurred nightmare of smoke, flashes, and tiny stricken figures. The carefully orchestrated plan had dissolved into a bloody stalemate. The 2 regiments ashore were being bled white on the tidal flat. Bradley's staff was tense. The fate of the entire American landing, perhaps of the invasion itself, seemed to hang on this strip of sand. The general, a quietly determined man not given to melodrama, turned to his chief of staff, Colonel Chester Hansen. His words, later recorded in Hansen's diary, were heavy with the weight of command. The situation at Omaha is critical. The troops are pinned down. The exits are not open. I'm considering diverting all subsequent forces to Utah or the British beaches. We may have to evacuate Omaha. It was a moment of profound crisis. To evacuate would mean leaving thousands to die or be captured, admitting a catastrophic defeat on the very first day. Bradley raised his binoculars one more time, sweeping them slowly across the smudge of land. He paused. On the eastern end, near the mouth of the E1 draw, something was different. Amid the chaos, there was a faint, ordered movement. A dark shape was pushing back and forth against the shingle bank. A bulldozer. And even as he watched, he saw a tiny figure break from cover and begin sprinting, a desperate, weaving dash across the sand toward that machine. "Wait," Bradley said, his voice tightening. "Look there." Dove's run was not heroic in his own mind. It was a series of base, animal calculations. Head down, move fast. Don't run in a straight line. The sand is soft, push harder. Machine gun tracers, glowing red in the overcast light, zipped past him, so close he felt the heat of their passage. A mortar shell detonated to his left, the concussion hitting him like a physical blow and filling his mouth with the taste of salt and burnt powder. Something sharp tugged at his trouser leg. He didn't look. 60 yards, 80, his lungs burned. He reached the silent dozer at 0853, throwing himself against the relative cover of its massive track housing. Shoemaker was still in the cab, frantically working the starter. "Flooded," he shouted over the din. "Salt water in the intake." Dove nodded, already moving. He climbed onto the hot engine deck, ignoring the sniper bullets now pinging off the blade. He unscrewed the wing nuts on the air cleaner canister, his fingers fumbling. A burst of machine gun fire stitched across the cab roof. One round punched through the thin steel 6 inches from Shoemaker's head, leaving a jagged hole of daylight. Shoemaker ducked, but didn't stop cranking. Dove pulled the filter. Murky seawater poured out. "Try it now!" The starter whined. The engine turned over, coughed wetly, ran for 3 seconds, and died. The problem was deeper. The waterproofing seals on the fuel lines had also likely failed, contaminating the diesel. They were mechanics now, under direct fire, with a machine that was dying from the inside out. Then Dove looked at the track. 3 of the massive steel links were sheared clean through. In a motor pool with a crane and a track press, this was a 2-hour job for a team of 4. They had a crowbar, a wrench, and maybe minutes before a mortar round found them, or a German anti-tank gun decided to end the puzzle. At 9 a.m., the tactical picture on Omaha Beach was at its absolute nadir. The tide had swallowed the first line of obstacles, drowning any wounded left there. Landing craft carrying the follow-on waves, including the 18th Infantry Regiment, were circling helplessly offshore, unable to land because the beach was jammed with wreckage and men. The congestion was becoming a massacre in slow motion. More men and vehicles were arriving onto a beach with no exits. It was a recipe for total destruction. Then, a decision was made offshore that would alter the battle. The captains of several American destroyers, seeing the disaster unfold, took an audacious risk. The USS Carmack, DD-493, USS Doyle, DD-494, and USS McCook, DD-496, steamed so close to shore that their keels scraped the sandy bottom in places. They turned parallel to the beach, exposing their entire length to German guns, and opened fire with their 5-inch 38 caliber batteries at near point-blank range, some as close as 800 yards. The effect was transformative. These were not the high-arcing, area saturation shots of the pre-dawn bombardment. These were direct, aimed shots. Gunners could see their targets. Shells slammed directly into the apertures of pillboxes, blew apart machine gun nests perched on the bluffs, and shattered observation posts. For the first time, the German defenders were under sustained, accurate, and devastating fire. Their rate of fire slackened noticeably. For Dove and Shoemaker, the roar of the destroyer's guns was a symphony of salvation. The immediate pressure lifted, just enough. Using the crowbar as a lever, Dove, with Shoemaker adding his weight, began the impossible task of muscling the multi-ton track back into alignment. It was a battle of inches, of grunting effort, of palms torn raw on cold steel. They weren't fixing it, they were jury-rigging it, forcing the broken ends close enough for the drive sprocket to maybe, just maybe, grab hold. "Now!" Dove yelled. Shoemaker hit the starter. The engine turned, coughed. Black, oily smoke billowed from the faulty exhaust. The engine roared to life, uneven and sickly, but running. Shoemaker engaged the left track only. The dozer pivoted clumsily on its dead right side. Then, with a horrible, grinding shriek, the broken track links, forced into place, engaged. The dozer lurched forward, out of the ditch. It was 9:14. They had a working machine, however crippled. Without a word, they resumed the rhythm. Blade load after blade load. Sand, stone, pieces of shredded landing craft. The detritus of war became the fill for the ditch. They were no longer just engineers. They were surgeons operating on the beach itself, slowly stitching a wound that was bleeding the life out of the invasion. By 10 o'clock, the ditch in front of exit E1 was half filled. A ragged, improvised causeway. The gap in the shingle was wide and graded. Lieutenant Colonel John T. O'Neill, who had assumed command of the shattered 37th Engineers, organized the remnants of his battalion and other scattered engineers. Using the last of their explosives, they blew the final wire obstacles and cracked the concrete roadblocks. The path was not perfect, not by any manual standard, but it was possible. At 10:32, history recorded a small, vital miracle. A Sherman tank of the 741st Tank Battalion, its crew having survived the drowning of their own craft and fought inland with the infantry, cautiously approached the gap. The tank commander peered out, saw the rough ramp, and gunned the engine. The tank clanked forward, treads slipping for a moment on the loose stone, then gained purchase. It crested the shingle, dipped into the partially filled ditch, and with a roar climbed out the other side. It was through. It turned left and began rumbling up the draw towards Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, engaging German strongpoints as it went. That single tank was the breach in the dam. Another followed. Then a jeep, laden with radio equipment. Then a truck. By noon, a ragged but relentless column was flowing through exit E1. The beach was no longer a trap. The lifeline was open. Dove and Shoemaker, their fuel exhausted, and their dozer's hydraulics finally failed completely, sat on the dead machine. Their hands trembled uncontrollably, a delayed reaction from 3 hours and 26 minutes of sustained, peak adrenaline. Around them, the beach still echoed with gunfire, but the sound had changed. It was no longer the sound of encirclement and slaughter, but of a bitter, expanding fight moving inland. They learned later that day that of the 48 men who had boarded LCI 553 that morning, only 31 were still alive. General Bradley did not evacuate Omaha Beach. The bravery of individual infantrymen, the point-blank courage of the Navy destroyers, and the desperate, determined work of engineers like Dove and Shoemaker had turned the tide. Exit E1 became the main artery off Easy Red Sector. By day's end, over 3,000 vehicles would use it. Bradley recommended both Dove and Shoemaker for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork climbed the chain of command, only to be downgraded by General Eisenhower's headquarters to the Distinguished Service Cross. The reasons remained debated. Quotas, a perception that engineering support wasn't direct combat, bureaucratic inertia. Bradley was reportedly incensed, believing the men had deserved the nation's highest honor. Winton Dove returned to Virginia after the war, carrying 2 Purple Hearts from later wounds and the DSC he rarely mentioned. He worked construction, raised a family, and lived until 2003. When asked, he always deflected, "I'm not a hero. The heroes are still on the beach. I just did what I was told. I was lucky." But a cold, statistical analysis conducted decades later at the U.S. Army War College stripped away the modesty and revealed the sheer, staggering improbability of his survival. Of the handful of armored bulldozers that reached Omaha, almost all were destroyed within the first hour, their operators killed. The study calculated that the volume of fire directed at Dove's position over his 3.5-hour ordeal exceeded 20,000 rounds of combined machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. Given the exposure time, the accuracy of the veteran German gunners, and the vulnerability of the target, the statistical probability of his survival was approximately 0.003%. The study's author, confounded, could only note that the event stood as a profound outlier, defying all standard models of combat survival. Sometimes in the chaos of war, the equations of fate are rewritten by an unyielding will and a simple, steadfast purpose. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the entire Allied invasion at Omaha Beach needed one lane open. And so, against all odds, the man on the bulldozer and the bullets meant for him somehow kept missing.